Some of you might have seen this talk or knew Andrew Yang, who founded a new party in the US in 2021. And he gave a TED talk about why US politics is broken and how to fix it. And his main argument in this talk was about changing the incentive system, changing to ranked choice voting, how Alaska is doing it, just to move people away from getting polarized and moving them being one nation again. So this talk, I think, is a nice anecdote to show how important the discussion of choosing the right voting method is. And this is what we wanted to scientifically explore in an experiment. So specifically, we asked the question, how are different voting methods perceived? And more precisely, how are they perceived with respect to legitimacy? So this is joint work together with Dirk, of course, and Regula and Vangelis, and some really amazing and brilliant student scientists. So we ran a behavioral experiment. And what I have to say is, like, by now we've heard this more often, but just to repeat, like, a voting method actually consists of two parts. But in this experiment, we only varied the input method. The aggregation method stayed constant. So we varied 4 different input methods. Choose 1 out of 5 options, also called majority voting. Approve, disapprove, or stay neutral, combined approval voting. Assign points from 0 to 1, range voting, and a 2-step voting method. So first choose the options you want to rank and then rank them. And that's called the modified border count. Our dependent variable was a measurement of legitimacy, which built upon Sharp's and Schmidt's definition of legitimacy, and they divided this concept into 3 parts. Input legitimacy, so who is participating in the process, output legitimacy, how much do we approve the outcome, and throughput legitimacy, so how legitimate do we perceive the whole process of this decision-making is. Regula, our co-author, she tried to find an empirical, straightforward measure towards that. So together with the PhD students, she ran an experiment where she asked 4 clusters of questions on trust, acceptance, fairness, and influence. And they found that most of these concepts primarily load upon one factor. So we decided that we can measure legitimacy in the end with 1 question. So what we asked our participants in our study was, please assess the following statement. I would comply with the result, accept it as fair, reflecting my and others' opinions. And this statement had to be rated on a 5-point Likert scale. We also had to choose a context within which the voting took place, and we deliberately chose a polarizing context because we wanted to have a broad range of opinions. So what I have to say is that we ran this experiment all the way back in 2021 when the COVID pandemic was in full swing. So we chose a COVID-related context. And we asked our participants, how should the government regulate vaccines? Who should get access to an ICU? Which measurements do you think protect you best? And which government strategy should be adopted? So these were our 4 COVID-related questions. And we also asked participants a control question. And this is actually how they started the experiment with. So first they answered their control question, why are all those 4 different voting methods? And then they gave us, or they provided their legitimacy rating of these voting methods. They then proceeded with the COVID questions, each again answering why are these 4 different voting methods. And again, then they provided a legitimacy rating. So this was just an abstract representation of how those voting methods work, but actually we had a really nice user interface that our student assistant Renato Kunz developed, and this we called it Vote Lab, and this is actually an app that you can, that's also free to use for you. So let's look at the results. So we have data from 120 participants. Most of them are male, quite young and highly educated. So it's not quite a representative sample, but at least it's kind of a diverse sample because they were coming like from 22 different countries. So the first question or the first result we wanted to look at was depending on the question and on the voting method, which of those 5 options did win? So this is just a sample question on which measure do you think protects best? And luckily, under each of those voting methods, the same option won, namely vaccination. However, for two other questions, we had kind of some variance. There were two different winning options, independent on the voting method, and we even had more variance for the ICU question. So this is one of our first findings, that winning options do vary by input method. And the next question that naturally follows is why? Why is this the case? And to look into this, we looked for what theory says. So how can we kind of quantify the difference between those four questions? And some very straightforward proposals just to measure the standard deviation in answers. Another proposal that Cesar Hidalgo actually presented on Tuesday was divisiveness, which is kind of a pairwise metric. And we calculated both of those metrics based on the numerically mapped answers of the votes. And what we see for standard deviation is that the highest density is actually achieved, the highest density and the lowest standard deviation is achieved for infection protection, which was also the question where we saw no variation. And there was only a slight change for divisiveness, but generally the picture is the same. The question that did not see any change in out or input dependency was infection protection. So what we conclude from this is that the choice of voting method is especially crucial when the context is highly polarized. So remember, we had those 4 COVID questions. We also had the color question. And for each of those questions, or for each of those voting methods that these 2 questions were answered on, participants provided a legitimacy rating of those voting methods. So what we, of course, asked was, well, how did this legitimacy rating change over the different voting methods? So we plot the rating on the y-axis against the 4 different voting methods. And what we see is that range voting receives the highest legitimacy rating, followed by the modified border count, combined approval, and majority voting. Also recognize that this order is kind of a perfect order in the decline with respect to nuance with which people could express their preferences via these voting methods. The order is similar for the control question, for the color question. And when we compare those 2 types of legitimacy ratings, then we see a significant difference in the extremes. This was a super interesting finding because we interpret it as flexibility in voting methods or in preference expression is perceived to be especially legitimate in a consequential or in a political setting. So the natural question is, what would we then recommend for politicians? Would we always say, well, range voting is the voting method to go? And actually, depending on the data of this experiment, we have to say, well, it depends on the voter. So remember that participants answered each question 4 times via those 4 different voting methods, which means that we actually can check how they whether they were consistent over those 4 different ratings. So let's look at some sample question concerning access to ICU. So let's say this voter would choose under majority voting no vaccine denials, the most important criterion to ICU access. They would approve this option, they would score it with 5 points under range voting, and they would rank it first under the modified border count. This would be our model consistent voter. An inconsistent voter would be someone who disapproves, it doesn't assign the highest points under range voting, or ranks it only second under the modified border count, despite choosing it as their most important option under majority voting. And what we actually see is that quite of a high share, 32% of participants were voting inconsistently across those four voting methods. So we checked, did the legitimacy ratings differ between those 2 groups? And they differed with respect to 2 voting methods, namely range voting and the modified border count. So what we conclude here is that, well, those people who are prepared and ready to express their preferences in a very detailed and consistent way also appreciate those flexibility in voting methods and therefore rate it as more legitimate, whereas others whose preferences might not be as readily stable do not appreciate this characteristic. So what are the main takeaways from this experiment? So first, different voting methods lead to different outcomes. The choice of method is especially important in a polarized context. The legitimacy, the perceived legitimacy, is also context dependent. Consistent voters appreciate flexibility more than inconsistent voters, and overall range voting received the highest legitimacy ratings. This paper got some media attention, so I translated it into 3 different languages for De facto. That's a science newspaper in Switzerland. I also was asked to give an interview for Spektrum der Wissenschaft, that's a science magazine in Germany. And it was really heartwarming to receive all of those emails from interesting citizens from all over the country who really wanted to know more about this research. And that was really motivating, and just showed how important this work that many of us in this room are doing. So I want to come back a little bit to the inconsistent voter, because actually back then when I saw those 32%, I was kind of surprised, but actually I shouldn't have been surprised, because preference reversal is well documented since the 70s. Back then, Liechtenstein and Slovak came up with this brilliant experiment of proposing 2 different lotteries and asking 2 slightly different questions. So one question was, which lottery would you prefer to play? And the other question was, how much would you be willing to pay for each lottery? And depending on how the question was phrased, the preference is reversed. Today, we know that the first question really focuses in on probability, and the second question really puts the spotlight on payout. And since then, a bunch of work has been done, also by Kahneman and Tversky, for example, and we know a lot more today about comparability bias, framing effects, and cognitive limitations. But what I'm asking myself as a behavioral scientist is, well, can we actually empower citizens to be less susceptible to these framing effects? We have seen in the context of urban planning, Javi has presented our experiment, that these framing effects do play a role, right? So we presented futuristic street scenarios in a sequential way, as is shown in this video, as opposed to a parallel way. And this made a difference in acceptance, safety perceptions, and so on. So it really shows, again, in this very specific context of urban planning, that we also see these effects. From practice in science, we know that citizens' assemblies, discussions, all of these methods can really help to reduce the effect of framing on preferences. However, what we see in Switzerland is that those activities are very often done offline. And in general, these activities are not easily scalable. And by contrast, very often what happens is that people form their preferences based on some online sources, some which might even be polarizing, and then offer these comment sections which would not be moderated and then result in a super unproductive discussion. And the question that I'm asking myself, is there a way to bring both of these together, to do some deliberation that is scalable and productive, to foster some more stable preferences? And I think given the recent technological advances, we have an exciting new possibility, namely virtual realities populated with LLM-powered avatars. Our brilliant student assistant, Michael, who is not here today, but who is doing all of our amazing VR work, or like the modeling work at least, has put this already into reality. So this is Gustavo, and you can even interact with him voice to voice, which increases the, the immersion and the enjoyment and how natural this discussion can be. And I really think that, filming some videos in this VR environment and then switching to a voice-to-voice capability can be something that is possible for being integrated into project websites, for example, and thereby making discussions scalable. Before doing so, we of course have to test in a very rigorous way on how we should structure these discussions. So we have planned this experiment, and we hope to conduct it soon, where Michael implemented the status quo of Lausanne in a VR environment. And then we took some design choices from a real ongoing city planning project and implemented them into our model. So in this case, there's more greenery and more bike paths. And then we populated this environment with LLM-powered avatars. And what we want to vary in this experiment is the discussion strategies, the conversation strategies. So how can we foster metacognition, activate metacognition, and at the same time avoid persuasion? And there are some really interesting new theories out there on democratic backsliding, perspective taking, reputation in nested group structures, or highlighting social perception that I think could be a super cool new way to structure discussions in these settings. So I see that I have 5 more minutes, so actually I can talk about something that I thought I need to skip. Another topic I've been thinking about was, can we transfer this knowledge on voting methods and aggregation methods? Can we transfer it to AI alignment? So can social choice theory inform this discipline? And just very basic, a lot of AI alignment is done via reinforcement learning from human feedback. And this is just a very crude explanation, but very crudely, it's done such that an initial language model produces a set of different outputs on a question, and then humans would vote upon these different options. These different options would be aggregated in some way, fed, and then out of that would be generated a kind of reward preference model, which would be used to tune our language model. So a question that I was asking myself, well, how should we ask about those preferences? Given the results I've been presenting, we see that simple majority voting might be misleading. It might change the outcome of this vote. So I really wonder whether using combined approval voting or range voting in this step could make a difference. And another point I've been thinking about was, well, the aggregation step, currently it happens via Bradley-Terry. But we know from a paper, and this paper won the Best Paper NeurIPS Award last year, so one of the biggest and most important computer science conferences. And from this paper, we know that who provides feedback matters. The sampling decisions do affect, if we sample differently, do affect collective welfare, and cross-cultural perspectives are not always in agreement. And actually all of these statements of whom to ask is kind of a different way of asking the question of how to aggregate votes. So given what we know from Josh's work, for example, that proportional aggregation in participatory budgeting settings does make a big difference, we could think about proportional aggregation in this RLHF framework as being an important question. So I guess I end here. Just showing my contact slides. So yeah, thank you for your attention and looking forward to your questions.